Imagine a world where you knew that you mattered and you belonged. The people cared about you because we were so darn good at listening to one another, no matter how different we are. That is what Sidewalk Talk is doing by putting listeners on sidewalks all over the world so that we can practice the art of connecting. Join me, founder and director Traci, as I interview experts on the fine art of human connection and interview some of our volunteers who've been listening on the sidewalk and even some of the folks that we've listened to. And if you want to volunteer, consider joining us at sidewalk-talk.org. Atiaf Alwazair. What a fun, beautiful connection. Two women, two mothers, two activists, two women who wrestle with mental health. Atiaf is noted for her participation in the Yemeni revolution. She documented the events on her blog and co-founded Support Yemen, which is a storytelling collective. Her articles have been published in many outlets that you know about, like The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Open Democracy, Fair Observer, and Al Jazeera. She's also the co-author of Change Square, which is a photo book on Yemen's revolution. She's currently working on a novel about female sexuality, identity, and healing, and a children's book on resilience. And our conversation weaved in and out of all of these experiences, but one of the things that I know Atiaf has written about was that when a country has been war-torn, that we don't want to just think of people as refugees. And we had the most connected conversation about Yemen, what they eat, her favorite food, how she dresses, her favorite rituals. And this is what Sidewalk Talk is all about, humanizing people and empowering them to tell their story rather than me telling her story. And I cannot wait for you to hear Atiaf Alwazair. So Atiaf Alwazair, I scoped you out. I actually heard about your work in a TEDx conversation here in Heidelberg that I was having. And I kind of found you online and found some of your writings. And I thought, wow, this is a woman that I would really like to be in dialogue with and listen to help me widen my embrace to a part of the world that I have to be frank, I don't know a ton about the Middle East. I don't know a ton about Yemen. And I thought that our dialogue could maybe help stretch us open a little bit. So thank you, first of all, for being here, because I know you're in demand and it means a lot. But tell me a little bit about who you are and what you're doing in the world.
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Traci, for having me. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. This question is always hard for me to answer. Like, who are you?
I know, right?
It's a very hard.
It's weird.
Question. Yeah, I don't know how to describe myself often, and I actually have a hard time writing like a bio, for example, because I've done many different things in my life, and I identify. I have many identities, I would say. And so it's often very hard for me. But I mean, in a summary, at the moment, I'm writing, and I'm trying to use my writing for activism and to tell stories of untold stories, often stories that are not necessarily in the mainstream media. I've done research. I continue to do that also, and I travel often to mainly the Middle East and North Africa, working on issues of gender, the intersection of art and politics, mainly, yeah.
So in addition to that, you have a private life. I get that this is a public conversation, but what else informs? So these are all the sort of work things that you do.
Yes.
And then in your day-to-day life, what part of the world do you live in? Do you get up and drink coffee or tea? I mean, who are you?
Okay, so I'm currently based in Brussels.
Uh-huh.
I moved here in August.
Okay,
recently, yeah. And before that, we were living in Lille in northern France.
Mm-hmm.
Before that in Tunis, in Tunisia. Before that in Yemen, and before that in Egypt, and before that in the US. And so I was born in Sana'a, Yemen.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about what's most on your heart these days, because I get that your identity has evolved. But to bring me into today, what's resting on your heart right now as a woman activist, artist, researcher, and I would say political activist?
I think that the thing that often, I don't know, occupies my mind lately is the situation in Yemen.
Yeah.
And that's it's partially because I think I was born there, so there's a connection there, obviously. Partially my family history as well, and another part is when I lived there, I really, really connected with the place at a very, very deep level, and with the people, with the architecture, with the food. I just really loved being there. And when I left in a very sudden way. It was late January 2015, and the situation was worsening. And one of the airports had closed, and my husband called me and we were discussing, and he said, listen, they might close the airport in the capital and you'll be stuck. You need to leave. And so within like a couple of hours, I was on a plane out, leaving the country. I didn't take my suitcase, and I didn't even say bye to any of my friends and family, just the people that were with me at the time. And on the plane, I felt really ashamed. I felt a sudden, I don't know, sadness, one, for leaving everybody behind, and shame that I had that privilege, that I could just leave immediately and just say, oh, bye guys. And so that stayed with me. That guilt really, really stayed with me. We were living in, I moved to Tunis at the time. And everywhere I went, I felt guilty if I'm at a restaurant, or guilty if I'm grocery shopping, guilty when I had electricity because they didn't have it at the time. And I thought I would go back, but then 2 months later, the airstrike started. And a week after that, I found out I was pregnant. So there was no way I was going back, with that situation. And so I think that really pushed me. For a while I was just frozen. I just was like, I drowned myself in this guilt and this self-pity. But then our former neighborhood in the old city of Sana'a was bombed, and our neighbors were killed. That really impacted me a lot. And my cousin in Yemen sent me a WhatsApp message with 3 jokes. And I knew that was his way of trying to make me feel better. And it hit me then that, he was the one living the war and I was out, yet I was the one kind of that closed myself off in this self-pity, right? And it also hit me that people are coping in different ways in the country. But I had this narrow vision of only looking at the terrible images, and of course it's really, really bad, but there is so much life that happens even during war, so much resilience, so much joy, and even in tragedy, humor is still present. And I kind of, that moment, I kind of started to look at things differently, and that's what I've been trying to do now, is kind of tell people let's not pigeon ourselves. When you just label people or label a country as, this is the worst place on earth, people start to believe it. The more you say it, the more they become that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm really hearing the real human impact on you, both of privilege, but guilt. And what comes to mind is kind of what Brene Brown has said, that we feel guilty, that there's something healthy about feeling guilty because it means that we're human. And I can imagine when I put myself in your shoes, Atiaf, that my guilt would come from, this is my home.
Yeah.
right? If it weren't my home, I wouldn't feel guilty, or I wouldn't feel as guilty. But what I'm hearing you talk about, you talk about your neighbors and architecture and food. This is your home, right? This isn't
Yeah.
a place on a map that I may see in the news and I don't have the same association with. And yeah, I just feel really with you in the intensity of you coming to safety and how you're metabolizing that for yourself. It sounds like what you're doing is you're turning it into widening the accuracy of the stories that come out of Yemen. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, even in the diaspora, I think war follows people.
Yeah.
And so even if you're safe physically,
Yeah.
emotionally, it's really hard because, like you said, it is home, and you're watching it. You're watching it, the places you love being destroyed. You're watching your people that you love living in fear, and you have nothing. You can't do anything about it, right? So you feel this extreme sense of helplessness, and that's really and a sense of, where do I belong?
Yeah.
So it's in a way it's really, really hard. But the only thing I think we can control in this kind of situation is not to let our memories be kind of hijacked by all this blood, because at the end of the day, the war will end, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10. Someday it will. We know, that from history.
Mm-hmm.
It will end, and the Yemen I lived is still there in essence, and it's hard to really keep that hope alive, or these memories. But for me, the more I write about them, that's how I'm able to remember, to really kind of I don't know, challenge the mainstream and say, this is my resistance. You will not make me forget the Yemen I lived.
It brings to mind an African American colleague of mine who said to me, my joy and being happy in the midst of injustice is an act of resistance as well.
Yeah.
Not to Pollyanna or sugarcoat, which I think sometimes we do too much, especially in American culture. But she said, no, I don't talking about that kind of joy, but that I can I can stretch my arms wide to the shadow and the light at the same time, because when I do, my embrace is even wider. And I thought that was really beautiful.
I completely agree with that. I mean, and I think it's just, the world is so chaotic. I don't know if it's always like this or just because we're living it, but we feel that it's just getting worse and worse and things are really bad. And I think it's quite revolutionary to try and to look at things a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's not easy, especially since I'm not sure you are the psychoanalyst, but maybe, I don't know if we're hardwired for negativity. I sometimes wonder,
We
we're
are.
just, yeah, okay, there you go. There you go. Because I feel like we're drawn to that, right? So it's very hard. It's my challenge to say, okay, you know what? Let's try and look at things differently, because I didn't always think this way, but I think recently, in the last couple of years, I've started to realize that, life is a balance. It's a balance of joy and gloom, and it's. I used to wish every, I don't know, now we're, January, every New Year's, this year will be better. But no, of course I'm going to have, very sad moments, and I will have joyful moments, and that's just life. Yeah, but I think it's also important not to focus on only one thing.
Yeah.
And I think I did that when I participated in Yemen's revolution in 2011. And I was really filled with the hope, like everyone else around me, because it was very beautiful. Like everything we saw, the way people came together, the fact that people stayed camped out for 1 year, over a year actually. And we were, people were making art, singing, dancing, book clubs were held, literacy classes, because we have a very high illiteracy rate, especially for women. So, there were free literacy classes. There were just so many activities. And I was focusing on that, And I think it was a bit naive, because I didn't want to also talk about, what are the possibility of failure? And on the other hand, you had the mainstream media only looked at the possibilities of failure, and almost like it's inevitable this is going to fail, you know. And I think both are wrong if you only focus on one. But I think what's missing really from the narrative today is a discourse of hope. It's very much missing from the story, and that becomes, we don't get the entire picture if we only focus on one side.
Yeah, I'm just taking in all these pieces there. I feel so much as I'm listening to you. I can feel your heart and how there's still so much here, which is totally understandable. So what I didn't tell you about myself before I became a therapist, what I studied was political science. And what I often think about when we are able to get to a people, to get them to be in such a mind state that there is no more hope, then there's also no more democracy or no more people, right? There's just the powers, the ruling powers that be then have greater capacity to continue to control, right? And so even the hopelessness becomes another political tool, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I also studied political science.
You studied international relations at American University.
Yeah. So I completely, I know where you're coming from, and that's exactly it. You know, I mean, the reason why I would go to a protest is because I have hope that this might change something. But if that's, you know, if you reach a point, which happened to me after the revolution, and I felt completely hopeless. I felt, you know, I was exactly what dictators wanted, extreme, like an apathetic person. That's it. You know, I didn't believe in any of these things anymore. And now I've kind of come back, and I think maybe I'm a bit more realistic about certain things, but and not realistic, but I think now I believe that change comes in many different forms, and there are many ways for people to help promote change, and and each person will bring something different to that process. And that's why I used to write a lot of like political analysis and more academic writing, and I've since switched kind of from that to more to fiction and storytelling. And it's not a critique of the other, forms. It's just where I am in life, I think. That makes sense.
So it sounds like you had just said change comes in many forms. And it sounds like, well, one of the forms could be policy analysis, but then another form is the storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm curious, as I listen to you, I've heard you really expose us all to what is an inner revolution, because you went from apathy to hopefulness again. And I'm curious because I identify in some ways there's a lot going on in American politics today. What has been your process? How have you been able to enlist your own resources to move from that apathy to a place of what I would call effective hopefulness rather than that mamby-pamby Pollyanna hopefulness?
I think, when I fell in a depression, I would say 2013, 14, I can't remember. And really major burnout. And I just stepped away from everything I used to do. And unfortunately that meant some friendships ended, because a lot of my friends were, we were all doing the same thing. And once you decide I can't do this anymore, not everybody gets why. That you need to just, take a step back. So that also was very hard and made me quite bitter for some time. But I think what happened also, and this might be a bit too personal, but I don't mind sharing it. But after I had my first Lilia, my daughter, I went also through very, very difficult time emotionally, and it was the first time that I had to face some personal childhood trauma that I had completely avoided and really buried very, very, very deep. And I think part of my because when I was part of the revolution, I wasn't just part of the revolution. It became my life. It was, morning, nights, everything, and even my relationship with my husband was, even though he was, very much encouraging and very much part of it. He still wanted, like, what every other relationship wants. Let's have some intimate time. Let's go out once in a while. But I just, I was completely immersed in the revolution. And in hindsight, I now think I was part of me. I, of course, believed in everything, and I never regretted, till this day, I don't regret my participation. But I do think that part of that complete immersion was I was running away from facing my own trauma. I was, we need to fix the world, or we need to fix this country, but I'm not going to look internally. And my child, having my child for some reason, forced me to do it. And so I found an amazing therapist that helped me through that period. And I was able to kind of articulate, find some words for what happened, and deal with it, and speak to my parents and tell my siblings for the first time. So that was very healing. But I still had other issues, about the war, about the guilt afterwards, and that was, I think, that took me a while to really understand and reflect on. And only through writing, I think through writing and reading and, continuing therapy, did that help. And I think it's a process. I mean, till this day, I don't think it's an easy fix. I don't think it's something overnight that changes. I think it's something that evolves, and at least for me. And it took a lot of different things. And at the same time, I was only focused on the kind of the emotional and mental aspect of it, and not my body. And more recently, starting I think 2 years ago, is when I said, and I realized, oh wait, everything's connected. And I realized, I have a lot of vitamin deficiencies, make me fatigued and tired. Could also lead to or emphasize certain anxieties. And I started doing, Tai Chi and acupuncture, like just trying to say it's okay to take time for yourself, and it's okay for you to recharge. And because if I'm not okay, I can't really help anybody. And if I'm not, I reached a point where I just saw the world that's so ugly, and you can't really help anybody if you think that of the world. You're not, what kind of beauty are you going to bring to it? What kind of change if that's all you see? And so I'm actually glad I stopped when I was feeling that way, because I don't think I would have helped anybody or myself.
Well, there's so much that I want to say. First of all, one of the things when someone, I do vulnerability differently now, because I'm more aware of privilege in the role of sharing vulnerabilities. And so I'm going to say me too, so that you're not out on the limb of vulnerability all alone. I have had to confront all the same things in running this project as well. My own trauma that might have informed why I sat on a sidewalk. So I just want to say I'm right there with you. Me too. Okay.
Thank you.
And then the second powerful thing is, I think that you probably are inspiring a lot of activists that are listening, because what I hear you saying is, I turned what might have been less effective hopefulness into more effective hopefulness when I was able to address the trauma that was driving my activism.
Yes.
Because now my activism is allowing me to be effective in how I generate hopefulness in the world, rather than depleting me and potentially setting me up for another episode of sort of discharge or disengagement or depression. I'm now setting up a foundation for my life so that I can remain effectively hopeful for the whole of my life.
Yes. That's. I guess that's a really good way of summarizing that. Yeah, I guess it is about effective hopefulness, and It's interesting because my parents, I come from a very hyper, maybe I can use that word, political family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my father and uncles were imprisoned for political reasons in Yemen at a very young age because of their father. So my grandfather's participation in another revolt, a previous revolt, and later on, my grandfather was actually beheaded. And my uncles really, and my mom had her other, went through also other, I think, traumatic events, and my family, I think maybe it's generational, maybe it's cultural, they just never talk about what happened, right? Never. They we know stories, the funny stories that happen in prison. I used to ask him to show us how he used to write secret letters with lemon juice and water, for example. Things like that they shared, but they never really shared how they felt. And I when I was going through this phase of just aversion to politics, it also meant aversion to my family's history, because they are very political. And my father couldn't really understand why I stopped, and he was quite disappointed. And I asked him, "Are you happy with your life right now?" Right now, as a, I don't know. I think he was 79. When you think back, were you happy, or are you happy now? And this question just seemed very strange to him. He didn't really know how to answer that. And he said, "I'm happy with my sacrifices." And I just thought, okay, I understand that, but I also want to, I mean, towards the end, I mean, he's still quite active in a different way, not, he also is a writer, so he writes. But what's interesting about him is he never I don't know if he ever went through what I went through, this phase. He just remained hopeful, but till this day, but he's also filled with anxiety. So much anxiety for everything. And I think part of if we want to maintain this for a long time, and we want to also enjoy this world that has some very beautiful elements to it, we have to look internally, so that we're not just living every day super anxious, super tired, super fatigued. Maybe for some people, they can do it until they're 80, like my father, but I'm not sure that of the quality of that life. And I'm not sure that's for everybody. I mean, I don't think I could have maintained that.
Well, I'm hearing that his alignment with sacrifice and duty became how he defined happiness. But I think that however a culture defines duty and sacrifice, I think in my country, duty and sacrifice is defined by how much you earn. But none of them are about what our internal structure, our soul. I mean, I'm going to go really woo-woo for a second and say what our soul is really calling us to do. And I do think that that does lead to the anxieties and mental health issues that seem to be a global phenomenon. They seem to strike every culture.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I just could go sit and have a long lunch with you, Atiaf. I know in reading some of your writings, I know how important this idea of broadening the stories of Yemen are to you. And I also know that you've been really active. You're kind of speak from the place of women from Yemen. I'd love to maybe ask you some of the other stories. I'd like to hear about what Yemen was like when you were coming up, or what's maybe your favorite moment, or your favorite cafe, or your favorite piece of architecture. Would you be willing to share a couple some of those joyful stories with us?
Of course. Let's see. I mean, I love, one thing that I find unique is the women's afternoon gatherings. Men have them too, but the women's gatherings are so, I don't know, they're just so beautiful. So every day after lunch, and often it's the women of the house that unfortunately still only make the lunch. And they wake up early, they're tired in the morning, they do all this work, Some go to the office, some work at home, and then they have to come back home and make lunch for everybody. But after lunch, they go take their shower, put on some, pick a nice outfit, and no matter what happens that day, they will have to go to this afternoon gathering. And it's sometimes at a friend's house, sometimes it's a wedding, sometimes it's someone maybe had a baby, so they go to her house. It's any celebration, right? And just in these gatherings, they talk about everything. There's no taboo subject, right? Everything. It's the most interesting conversations. And actually, I love just sitting and listening there. So I think you would have loved it.
I know I would.
Because you just hear all these different stories, and I think that's their way of, that's their me time,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And women who have kids, I've been thinking about it now because with my child, they bring the kid along, and then the kids play together, and there's often a 15-year-old that's watching them. So it's like free babysitting while you're hanging out with your friends. And it's just, and I just love that every single day, no matter what, they're gonna do this. Even during times where there was conflict. I remember specifically one night where I woke up at 3 a.m. because of explosions, and the clashes lasted until noon. But that day it was my cousin's wedding, and I had assumed they would postpone it, but they didn't. And when I went, I was shocked to see so many women, dressed in like very, I don't know, yellow and red and beaded clothes. And I decided to put on black because I was in mourning over the situation. And I really, in my self-righteousness, I really judged them. Like, people are dying and you're partying. I was so, but then someone forced me to get up and dance. And I don't know, I got in this zone. And I remember I finally understood, and I love this poet, and I understood his words, Jalaluddin Rumi, and he said, if I remember correctly, dance in the middle of the fighting, dance in your blood, dance if you're perfectly free. And I finally, I really understood that. And I thought, yeah, I think that's what's really amazing about, I don't know, being in these moments that change your perception, is that you go in thinking something, and then you change your mind about it. And I think if we all, since we're talking about listening, that's a big part of listening. I think if we try to go, I don't know. Well, I went in with a judgment, but if we just try and really believe that there are other realities and not immediately judge people, maybe we'll be better listeners. But those are some examples. I love the food. It's just really, really good.
Well, so tell me about the food. What did you eat?
So there's a lot of rice, but different kinds of rice. So it's like rice marinated with onions and garlic and tomatoes and pine nuts and different kinds of nuts, and rice with meat, rice with chicken. Fish is so good. There's my favorite dish is this. It's called shafut, and it's yogurt based. It's yogurt, mint, cilantro, garlic, and it's just with this kind of a bread that looks like French crepes, very thin, but doesn't taste different. It's savory. And it's so simple, but it's so nice. And then with pomegranate on top, it's so fresh. For summer, it's perfect. That's probably my favorite. And then the tea with milk and like 4 different spices. It's kind of like a Indian chai tea, which probably Yemenis got it from India. Maybe, I'm not sure. But and a lot of the food, we have these spices that we mix. We have 7 spices that we mix, and we put in almost, a lot of the dishes. So I try and make it here, in Belgium. So the spices, I get fresh spices and then I grind them and I just put it in a Tupperware or something and just try and use it every time. And that also transports me back, just the smell of the food, and it kind of I introduce my daughter to the flavors.
Mm-hmm. Well, she might remember some of it when she was in your belly too.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
I just love, it's funny as you're talking about food, and then as you were describing the dancing scene from the wedding, I almost feel like I can smell it. Like I can kind of close my eyes. I have a grin on my face right now, and I'm like, oh, I can almost feel like I get a sense, right? Or it's very sweet. I don't know that I've talked to many of our guests about their food before, but maybe it's going to become a new trend. Oh, this is great. Listen, I know that I sort of scheduled for a set period of time, and we're near the end of our conversation, although I could listen to you and sort of I just want to say thank you for the earnestness of you being on a journey. I think it's easy for people that are academics or researchers to sort of have a fixed idea about the world, but I hear what you're doing is something I guess I value, which is you're just in a state of a real, I would say, high integrity evolution as a human being. And I like people that are in places of high integrity evolution as human beings. Like you've moved out of that self-righteous place. It feels like you're really in a place of righteous integrity. And I really admire that in listening to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We have a little bit of a tradition, how we close the dialogue here on the Sidewalk Talk podcast, which is I get out of the way and I let you speak directly to the 7,000 volunteers that listen on sidewalks around the world. And you get to choose. You can offer them either words of wisdom, or you can offer them a wish directly to them as they go out in the world and they listen.
Okay. To think about this.
I know as a writer, you're going to be particularly interested in what do I really want to say. No pressure, though.
All right. And it's for people that are listening, right? The volunteers It's
the volunteers on the sidewalk.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do I just say it now? Sorry.
You can just say it.
Okay. I think the one thing I will share with you or hope is that you move away from the idea of a single label or single narrative and maybe try or accept that the uncertainty of the world and that people may have very different ideas of what the world would look like. And I think only then can we really, really listen. And good luck. It's a beautiful thing that you're doing.
Wow, it's great. Letting go of that uncertainty. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's a beautiful thing that you're doing in the world too. And I hope that you write a really beautiful fictional romance novel about Yemen sometime that I can read that includes food and dancing.
I hope so too. It's on my list. So fingers crossed.
Well, congratulations on baby number 2. And perhaps we'll be lucky enough to meet in the flesh. I live in Germany now. And so
not too far.
Traveling through Belgium, I will be sure and reach out to you.
Yes, please do. I would love to meet.
All right, Atiaf. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of the Sidewalk Talk podcast. If you like what you heard, tell your friends, tell your family, like and comment on the podcast publisher that you're listening from, and subscribe. This will help us get the word out about changing our culture to one of connection.